Let's dive straight into it. I made massive changes to the combat mechanics. The first thing I did was alter how the health bar worked. Previously, it would be dangerous to be above a certain threshold, which was about 80%. So to communicate this to the player, I put a bar on the 80% mark of the resource bar. For a while it looked fine, but the more I played, the less I liked it. It looked awkward, out of place, and I didn't want to keep it. I had to think of an alternative. One of the things I tried before was having the threshold when the bar was at its maximum. So I went back to that, but there were a few things I had to address. I had to delay the time at which the bar would start to reduce, because if it immediately started going down or healing when it reached its maximum, then there would be no point to it. I added a timer that is tied to the amount of the current health the entity has. So to communicate this timer, I added an additional bar beneath the health bar. I'm calling it health right now to be clear, but it is the lucidity bar. The heal rate or speed is also affected by the current health. I didn't want to change the core gameplay, which was to encourage aggression and proactivity. If the player is too passive, then the enemy will eventually heal over time. Since the bar could now stay at its maximum for a certain amount of time, that meant any actions tied to that resource would be halted or just unusable. Before this, it was rolling, sprinting, and jumping that required the bar to be less than full. Well, to adjust to this new change, I threw all of that out the window. The player and anything else can now roll, sprint, and jump to their heart's desire, even when the bar is full. So it no longer strictly acts like a stamina bar. The only actions that actually require any resource are spells, and that's the elucidity resource. With that being implemented, I wanted to add more types of attacks. I worked on undodgeable and unblockable attacks. It felt appropriate especially to add undodgeable attacks since the player could now roll or dodge without having to worry about any depleting resource. While working on these new attacks, I had remembered something I learned from my past game. I could actually create my own anim notifies and notify states. So these are the tags, flags, bars, or whatever you want to call them that can be added to an animation. Then I figured out a way that I could use these notifiers so I don't have to tie the functionality to the skeleton. This is a big deal because I had been using skeleton notifiers this entire time, which meant all the enemies and even the player character I was making had to use the same skeleton if I wanted them to have the same mechanics such as attacking, healing, or anything else. So the way this works is that on the notify, I can grab the owner of the skeleton and call a function from the interface. So an interface is a way to communicate with blueprints and can be added to anything regardless of what they are. Going forward, this is very helpful because it means that I can make new types of enemies that don't have to use the same skeleton I've been using this whole time. So I could add things like dogs, bats, birds, centaurs, horses. It doesn't have to be humanoid. Naturally, I made a lot of new notifiers and 2 notify states for attacking and grabbing. For the undodgeable and unblockable attack, I drew some new images to signify what type of attack was going to come. White for the undodgeable and blue for unblockable. It appears for at least a second or more on the enemy as a warning to the player. Making grab attacks was a bit trickier. Firstly, because it needs to put the 2 entities involved in the perfect and proper position for it to look like it's actually happening. I started off with a grab trace. This is where the entity will check for things to grab. If it fails, nothing happens. If it succeeds, then the grab attack occurs. I made a grab attack struct for this. It contains a few variables, the important ones being the montages for the attacker and the attack. So these 2 animations play at the same time for both parties involved. To line up these 2 animations, the struct also contains a transform variable which contains the location and rotation that the grabbed entity will take. I found the right transform value by basically testing and moving the position of this grab arrow I put on the actors. It might not be the best way to do it, but it worked. I didn't want the damage to be dealt with an attack trace, so I added a notify that basically deals direct damage to the entity being grabbed. It's working well so far after some testing. I also added a short event that plays when a boss is defeated to celebrate the player's victory. A new enemy has been added to the roster, a skeleton archer. This also needed some new things to be added. I improved the functionality of weapons being added to the entities. I still do it manually, but it also adds the collision at the same time that the weapon is added. The bow of the archer has an animation, but you can't play animations on static meshes, which most of the weapons, actually all of the weapons were. So I added an option to have a skeletal mesh as a weapon. Then I made a new notify to play the weapon's animation, which I can call on any specific attack animation. Then I made a new projectile for the arrow. One of the notifies I added was an extremely useful one, where I can choose specifically what projectile spawns from the animation. For now, the arrow is slow, since it's the first range attack that players will encounter. Another useful notify added is responsible for setting important variables before the attack. It sets which weapon to use for the attack trace, what type of reaction the hit entity should take, if the attack can be interrupted, and if it is unblockable or undodgeable. I will continue testing the fighting loop, but I believe I'm headed in the right direction. After refining the combat, I will be returning to the other half of the game, which is the home building. I have a lot of major changes I want to implement there as well. Peace out.